Hello and welcome to the Hobby Corner. My name's Kev and this is my Mortal Realms series. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the painting section of issue 7, no building this time. And I'm going to be covering some do's and don'ts with those techniques. So stay tuned to find out more. So before we get started, please make sure that you've hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so you don't miss any single episode like this one. Also, there are plenty of links down below from social media, tons of fantastic groups to socialize in, and also ways of supporting the channel. There's also a link to the Chilling Wargamers Network website where there's plenty of free content to check out, so go have a look. So without further ado, let's get to it. Alright, so what you're going to need is your model, whichever one, and you can put it on a paint handle if you've got one. If not, don't worry, you can use your hands. Some kitchen roll or something to dry your brush on, fresh water, your Rectifying fresh shade. I've put this silver to one side for the moment. You can use a palette, but I find that you end up wasting some of the shade. So what I do is, as long as it's not hot in the house, you can have the shade open without fear of it drying. But one big thing is that people tend to knock it over by accident, so I always get a big ball of blue tack, make sure it's sealed first, pop that underneath like so, and then just squeeze it on like that, and it's nice and rigid. There we go. And always make sure that you give it a shake first. Now I'll be using this medium shade brush because it speeds things up. You can use a larger brush if you wish, but if you haven't got any other brushes and you just got your starter brush, it will still do the job. Just make sure you rinse it every so often so that you don't get the shade migrating up to the ferrule. So this bit's pretty easy. You just load up your brush like so, and then you start shading it. Now you do it section by section so you don't miss anywhere. So I'll start with a shield, and you want to try and push it as much as possible into all of the recesses like so. And you see that looks lovely. It just pulls in there and it tints the color nicely, so it gives it a richer color. And you want to put it everywhere because we're not too fussy about where it's going to be, because when we paint in the details later, it'll be a little while before you get around to that. So it just looks awesome just to kind of almost be painted, even if it's not the final product. You just go around like that, and there you go. Now don't worry if you end up splodging too much like so, because you can always just push it somewhere else, or you can soak it up by rinsing and drying off your brush and then just going over it so it doesn't pull too heavily into those nooks and crannies, and that way you'll get a nice effect. How cool is that? So just carry on, do the entire thing. Whether you want to do the face, that's up to you. I wouldn't bother, to be honest. And the same with the base. Unless you can see something on there, like some have books, so they'll have like a little metal bit on the book, or for example the Castigos, they have little bits of ruins. You can just shade those, no problem, because you can paint them wherever you bloody well like. So yeah, do that, and once it's dry, make sure it is dry properly. We'll go on to the next bit. One tip though is that when you are applying this, apply it quickly. If you take too long, or if you go back to a bit that's already drying, you're going to end up with something called tide marks. So you can't see it here, but it'll be like where it's dried already, but then you're reapplying a wet shade to that dried shade, and it will wet and loosen it again. so you get like a tearing effect on that paint underneath. So to avoid that, make sure you cover the area that you're going to do and then don't go back to it. And that way you won't get those weird marks. If you do, just paint over with the gold, let that dry, and then shade again. So very simple way to fix it, but there you go. So once that's dry, we'll then move on to the next paint, the Stormhost Silver. Okay, so here's the comparison of the two models. You see they look pretty good there. So what we're going to do is get the Stormhost Silver. Got to give it a real good shake because it's brand new and it's metallic, and they do need a good bit of mixing before you get started. What you want to do is put some on the palette. Normally I'll use a bigger, softer brush, like a dry brushing brush, but just for the sake of the magazine, I'm going to show you how to do it with the starter brush. So you work it into the bristles on a bit of a kitchen roll or paper, and then I'll do a knuckle test. I'll rub it across the creases of the knuckle, and if you get streaks of it, then there's too much. Rub it on the paper, get rid of the excess, try again, and then you'll know if it's only leaving a little dusting, if it's right. Then we move on to the model. So you want to try and get all the raised areas and the sharp edges. Don't worry so much if you get the flatter areas. You just don't want to get into the recesses. If you do, then that's not going to be an issue either, because you can always go back and repaint certain areas. But as you can see, you're just going over gently across the top, and don't feel rushed with it. Take your time with it, and you can see the difference right there. It's very stark. So as always, don't bother doing the rest of the model, just do the armor areas and the weapon and stuff like that, not the cloth or the face. Here's an example how to rectify any mistakes. So here I put far too much of the silver, so I repaint the entire section of the armor with Retributor Gold, and then once that's fully dried, I go back with the Rectifying Flesh shade and shade the entire thing again. And then once that's dried, I then go back over with a light dry brush of the Stormhost Silver, making sure not to repeat the same mistake. And yeah, that's all you really have to do. It's pretty simple at this stage, but it looks good. So as you can see, shading with this color with these models is a lot simpler than if you were to shade something that required recess shading. You just slap it all on. But do sort of try and save as much of that shade as possible by just shading the areas that you know will need it and are going to be painted and stay as gold in the future. Don't bother painting the cloth or the skin. It's just, you're wasting your shade then. And when it comes to dry brushing with thin metallics like the layer paint, it's always worth just being careful and playing it as it behaves. You know, if it behaves a bit more fluid, then make sure you just dry it off a bit more, because with a base paint or a dry paint, they're not made to be as fluid. You know, a layer paint is supposed to be thin, so you can get that nice thin highlight. But dry is specifically for dry brushing, and bases are specifically for putting on a thick undercoat. So yeah, as I said, just play it by it. Anyway, enough waffling with that. I hope you found this video interesting and helpful. Please let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.